He didn't shove her to correct her. He drove his palm between her shoulders like she wasn't human, laughing as she hit the hardwood, glass exploding around her like shrapnel. The room froze. Even the jazz choked silent. Because 20 feet away, a man with rolled sleeves, chest tattoo peeking from his collar, and eyes carved from discipline rose from his booth, slow, calm, already deciding how painful this lesson would be. And the manager? He has 3 seconds left before he realizes he didn't just bully a waitress. He touched someone who belongs to the one man in this city nobody survives crossing. So what happens first, the apology, the screams, or the silence? If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. Thomas Green shoved Sophia Delgado hard between the shoulder blades, sending her crashing onto the hardwood floor of the Brass Lantern bar. The tray flew from her hands, glasses shattering like fireworks across the amber-lit floor, whiskey and gin, mixing with shards of crystal. Maybe you're not cut out for this kind of work, Thomas growled, his voice cutting through the jazz melody that had been humming from the speakers. 40 patrons sat frozen, forks hovering over steaks, wine glasses paused mid-sip, all eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Sophia slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her dark hair falling across her face, not saying a word, not crying, not pleading. But in the next 5 minutes, Thomas Green would realize he had just committed the gravest mistake of his life. Because the woman he had just knocked down wasn't just another desperate waitress trying to make rent. She was under the personal protection of the one man in this entire city you never, ever crossed, Paul Ricca. And he was sitting 20 feet away, watching everything. The evening had started like any other at the Brass Lantern. Warm lighting glowed from vintage Edison bulbs, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. The dinner rush was in full swing, businessmen loosening ties over bourbon, couples sharing dessert, regulars claiming their usual corner tables. Sophia had been moving through it all with that careful precision she'd developed over her first 2 weeks, balancing trays, memorizing orders, trying desperately to remain invisible. She'd been carrying a full tray of top-shelf liquor to table 7 when her foot caught on the uneven floorboard near the bar. It was a slight stumble, barely noticeable. She'd recovered immediately, steadying the tray with practiced balance. But Thomas had seen it. His cold eyes had tracked the movement, and something in him had ignited. Not concern, not the instinct to help, pure, calculated cruelty. He'd crossed the floor in 4 long strides, his jaw clenched with that familiar rage the staff had learned to fear. Without warning, without words, he'd shoved her, hard. The kind of shove meant to humiliate, to remind everyone in the room who held power and who didn't. Now Sophia knelt on the floor, her white shirt soaked with whiskey, her palms pressed against the hardwood among the glittering shards. She didn't look up, didn't defend herself. She simply breathed slow, measured breaths that seemed almost meditative in their control. "Get up," Thomas hissed, standing over her with his arms crossed. "Clean this mess, and if you can't handle the job, maybe you should find work somewhere else." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman at the bar opened her mouth as if to protest, but her husband touched her arm, shaking his head. Nobody challenged Thomas Green. That was the unspoken rule at the Brass Lantern. But then came the sound. A chair scraping against hardwood. It was a subtle sound, barely audible beneath the jazz still playing overhead. But it carried weight, the way thunder carries weight even before you hear the full crash of it. From the corner booth, partially hidden by the strategic placement of a decorative divider and the low amber lighting, a man rose slowly to his feet. Paul Ricca stood 6'2", his broad shoulders filling out a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Intricate tattoos covered his forearms, symbols and script that told stories only certain people could read. His thick beard was immaculately groomed, his dark hair combed back, revealing a face carved from stone and patience. His eyes, dark and utterly calm, fixed on Thomas Green with the kind of attention that suggested he was memorizing every detail for later. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He simply began walking forward, his footsteps measured and deliberate, each one falling like a gavel in a silent courtroom. The 2 men who'd been sitting at the bar noticed immediately. They exchanged a glance, their faces draining of color, and quietly slid off their stools, backing toward the exit. Thomas was still standing over Sophia, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, drunk on his own sense of authority. But Sophia, still on her knees, still breathing slowly, finally lifted her head. And for just a moment, just one fleeting second, the corner of her mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, because she knew what was coming. And the brass lantern would never forget what happened next. If you felt your chest tighten just now, don't just watch. Hit subscribe, because what comes next will stay in your head all night. 3 weeks earlier, Sophia Delgado had arrived in the city with nothing but a worn duffel bag, $200 in cash, and a phone number written on the back of a business card. The card was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, the ink slightly smudged from nervous fingers. It simply read, Paul Ricca and a local number. No title, no address. Just a name that meant everything to those who knew, and nothing to those who didn't. She'd stood outside the bus station for 20 minutes, watching people rush past with their purposeful strides and expensive coats, wondering if she'd made a mistake coming here. The city felt too big, too loud, too indifferent. Back home, no. Not home anymore, she reminded herself back there. Everyone knew everyone's business. Here, she could disappear, and disappearing was exactly what she needed. The phone call had been brief. Paul's voice, deep and measured, had asked only 2 questions. Are you safe? And do you have a place to stay? When she'd answered no to the second question, he'd given her an address and told her a key would be under the mat. Tomorrow, he'd said, we'll talk about work. The apartment was small but clean, a studio in a neighborhood that straddled the line between working class and forgotten. It had a bed, a table, a kitchen the size of a closet, and bars on the windows. To Sophia, it was a palace. For the first time in 3 years, she'd slept without listening for footsteps in the hallway. Now, as she knelt on the floor of the brass lantern, surrounded by broken glass, that memory felt like it belonged to someone else, some other version of herself, who still believed the world might offer mercy without demanding payment. She'd learned better since then. In her first week at the bar, Sophia had kept her head down, spoken only when necessary, and perfected the art of reading a room. She watched how Thomas moved through the space like a storm system, staff members checking his location before stepping into the open, conversations dropping to whispers when he approached. She'd seen him berate a busboy for leaving water spots on glasses, watched him dock a server's pay for smiling too much at male customers, observed the way he positioned himself in doorways, blocking exits, making people squeeze past him just to remind them who controlled the space. She recognized the behavior immediately. Different uniform, different location, but the same disease. A man who confused fear with respect, control with strength. The other servers had tried to warn her in their careful, quiet ways. Don't make eye contact when he's in a mood. If he starts asking personal questions, keep your answers short. Never, ever correct him, even if he's wrong. Sophia had thanked them and continued working, because she'd survived worse than Thomas Green. She'd survived someone who made Thomas look like a child playing dress-up with his father's authority. In her small apartment, tucked inside the front pocket of her duffel bag, she kept a photograph. It was the only personal item she'd brought with her, a picture of 2 people she'd left behind to keep them safe. A woman with kind eyes and a child with a gap-toothed smile. No names written on the back. No date. Just faces she saw every time she closed her eyes. She'd made a promise to them. I'll build something better. I'll become someone who can protect instead of hide. I'll survive long enough to bring you here. Every shift at the brass lantern was a step toward that promise. Every dollar saved brought them closer. Every moment of Thomas's abuse she endured in silence was a choice, not weakness, but strategy. What Thomas mistook for submission was actually patience. What he read as fear was actually calculation. And what he'd never understand, what his small, cruel mind couldn't possibly comprehend, was that some people don't need to fight back immediately because they know something he doesn't. Protection doesn't announce itself. It doesn't negotiate. It simply arrives when the moment demands it. As Paul Ricca's footsteps grew closer, as the jazz music seemed to fade into the background, as the entire bar held its collective breath, Sophia remained perfectly still, not because she was broken, but because she was finally, completely safe. And Thomas Green was about to learn the difference. If you're watching this and still haven't subscribed, ask yourself why. Do you really want to pretend you're just passing through? Everyone who cares about stories like this is part of this family. Don't be the outsider. Paul Ricca's reputation in the city wasn't built on volume. It was built on consistency. When he gave his word, it became law. When he made a promise, it was carved in stone. And when someone under his protection was threatened, The response wasn't loud or theatrical, it was absolute. People who understood power recognized that the quietest men in the room were often the most dangerous. Paul Ricca was the kind of quiet that made seasoned criminals check over their shoulders. He'd earned his position not through inheritance or luck, but through a combination of strategic brilliance and an unshakable code that even his enemies respected. In a world where loyalty was a commodity bought and sold by the hour, Paul treated it like a sacred oath. His people didn't follow him out of fear, they followed him because he'd proven, time and again, that he valued their lives more than his own comfort. The stories about him circulated through the city's underground like folklore. There was the time he'd walked into a rival's territory alone to retrieve a young man who'd gotten in over his head with gambling debts. No weapons, no backup, just Paul and his reputation. He'd walked out 30 minutes later with the kid, and the debt erased. No one ever explained exactly what was said in that room, but the rival operation dissolved within a month. There was the warehouse fire that had threatened to destroy a family-owned business, one that employed half the neighborhood. Paul had made a single phone call, and within hours, firefighters had resources they'd been requesting from the city for years. The family never knew who'd helped them. That was Paul's way. Power used quietly, influence applied precisely. But it was his code about protection that defined him most clearly. Anyone under my care is family, and no one touches family. It wasn't a threat. It was a fundamental law of his existence. 3 weeks ago, he'd received a call from an old friend, a woman named Elena, who ran a shelter 2 states away. "I have someone who needs to disappear for a while," Elena had said, her voice tight with concern. "She's been through hell, Paul. She needs time to rebuild without looking over her shoulder every 5 minutes. Paul hadn't asked for details. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the specifics didn't matter, only the need did. "Send her here," he'd said simply. "I'll make sure she's taken care of." When Sophia had arrived, he'd seen immediately what Elena meant. The way Sophia held herself, shoulders slightly hunched as if expecting a blow, eyes that tracked every movement in her peripheral vision, the careful control of someone who'd learned that survival meant becoming invisible. He recognized it because he'd seen it before in others he'd helped rebuild their lives. He'd set her up with the apartment, made a call to Vincent, the owner of the Brass Lantern, an old friend who owed him more favors than either of them could count. "I need you to hire someone," Paul had said. "She's good people, quiet, reliable. She needs steady work and no questions." Vincent had agreed immediately. "Thomas manages the floor most nights, but I'll make sure he knows she's not to be bothered." But Vincent had been out of town the last 2 weeks, and Thomas had been left in charge. Paul had planned to check in on Sophia tonight, just a quiet observation from a distance to make sure she was settling in. He'd chosen the corner booth specifically, positioned where he could see the entire floor without being immediately noticeable. He'd watched her work for 40 minutes, noting the efficiency of her movements, the professional distance she maintained with customers, the way she'd started to relax into the rhythm of the job. Then he'd seen Thomas watching her. And he'd recognized that look instantly, the predatory assessment of someone who'd identified their next target. Paul had set his whiskey down and waited, because he needed to see what Thomas would do. Needed to know if this was just a manager having a bad night or something worse. Needed to understand the full scope of the problem before deciding how to solve it. Then Thomas had shoved her. And in that single moment of violence, Thomas Green had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Paul rose from his seat, his jaw tight, his hands relaxed at his sides, the controlled calm of someone who'd made a decision and would not be swayed from it. Thomas had just touched family, and consequences were walking toward him in polished leather shoes. Thomas Green had been managing the Brass Lantern for 3 years, and in that time, he'd perfected a system. Control through intimidation, loyalty through fear, respect through domination. It was a philosophy he'd inherited from his father, a bitter man who'd run a construction company the same way, ruling over workers with an iron fist and a hair-trigger temper. Thomas had learned early that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who took what they wanted, and those too weak to stop them. He'd built his entire identity around being the first type. The staff turnover at the Brass Lantern was legendary. In 3 years, Thomas had gone through 42 servers, 18 busboys, and 7 bartenders. Most quit within weeks. A few lasted months before the constant criticism and public humiliations broke them. Vincent, the owner, had mentioned the turnover once, but Thomas had smoothly deflected, blaming this generation's work ethic and people who can't handle real jobs. What Thomas never acknowledged, what he possibly couldn't see, was that his cruelty came from a deep, festering insecurity. He'd peaked in high school as a linebacker with college prospects, until a knee injury sophomore year had ended that dream. He'd watched former teammates go on to scholarships and success while he'd stayed behind, taking a management position at his uncle's bar. Every server who worked under him represented something he couldn't articulate: the life he'd wanted, the respect he'd never earned, the power he'd never legitimately possessed. So he took it, one public humiliation at a time. Sophia had seemed like the perfect target from day one: quiet, deferential, new to the city with no apparent connections. She never pushed back, never complained, never met his eyes when he criticized her. To Thomas, that silence was confirmation of his authority, proof of his power. He'd been building up to tonight's confrontation for 2 weeks, testing boundaries with small cruelties, criticizing her uniform, assigning her the worst sections, docking her pay 15 minutes for arriving at 4:47 instead of 4:45. Each time, she'd simply nodded and continued working. Her compliance had emboldened him. When he'd shoved her tonight, it was meant to be a statement, a public demonstration that he controlled this space and everyone in it. The fear in the other servers' eyes, the shocked silence from the patrons, even the sound of glass shattering, it all fed something dark and needy inside him. Standing over Sophia's kneeling form, Thomas had felt something close to euphoria. This was power. This was control. This was respect. Then he'd heard the chair scrape. Now, as Paul Ricca walked toward them with that measured, deliberate pace, Thomas felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine. Something in the room had shifted. The other servers had gone pale. The 2 men at the bar had actually left. And the patrons were no longer looking at Sophia with pity, they were looking at him with something that resembled fear. For him, "Is there a problem here?" Thomas tried to inject authority into his voice, but it came out slightly higher than intended. Paul didn't respond immediately. He simply continued walking, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face. When he reached them, he stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be threatening, far enough to be controlled. "Step away from her," Paul said quietly. The voice was low, almost gentle, but something in it made Thomas's hands tremble. "I'm the manager here," Thomas said, but his conviction was cracking. "This is my floor. She works for me, and she doesn't work for you," Paul interrupted, his tone unchanged, still quiet, still calm. Still absolutely terrifying. "She works at an establishment you temporarily manage. There's a difference." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but Paul took 1 step closer. Just one. And Thomas's words died in his throat, because he finally saw what everyone else had already noticed. The tattoos on Paul's forearms weren't decorative. The way he stood wasn't casual. And the look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was calculation. The cold assessment of someone deciding exactly how much mercy to extend. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Paul said, his voice dropping even lower. "Step away from her." This time, Thomas's legs moved before his brain could process the command, and he suddenly understood. He hadn't been demonstrating power tonight. He'd been revealing exactly how powerless he'd always been. Thomas stepped back, his polished shoes crunching on broken glass, and Paul moved past him as if he'd ceased to exist. The manager might as well have been furniture, irrelevant, invisible, already forgotten. Paul knelt down beside Sophia, his movements careful and deliberate. "Let me see your hands," he said softly, his voice completely different now, warm, concerned, almost paternal. Sophia turned her palms up slowly. Small cuts decorated her skin where she'd caught herself on the shards, tiny beads of blood mixing with whiskey. Her white shirt was soaked through, sticking to her shoulders, and her dark hair had fallen loose from its ponytail. But her eyes were dry, calm, almost serene. Paul pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, the old-fashioned kind, pressed and folded, and gently began dabbing at the cuts. "You okay?" he asked quietly, meant only for her. "Yes," Sophia whispered, not a tremble in her voice, not a hint of the victim everyone expected her to be. "Good." Paul helped her to her feet with the kind of gentleness that seemed impossible from a man his size. His hand on her elbow was steady, supportive, but not controlling. He brushed a piece of glass from her sleeve. "Go to the back. Clean up. Take your time." Sophia nodded once and walked toward the kitchen, her posture straightening with each step. The other servers parted for her like water, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. She wasn't crying, wasn't shaking, wasn't broken, and that's when the whispers started. "Who is that guy?" someone murmured at table 4. "Did you see his tattoos?" A woman whispered to her date. Why isn't she upset? Another patron asked, confused by Sophia's composure. One of the bartenders, Danny, who'd worked at the Brass Lantern longer than anyone, leaned toward his coworker and whispered urgently, "That's Paul Ricca. I've seen him before. We need to stay out of this." "Who?" the younger bartender asked. "Just trust me. Don't look directly at him. Don't get involved. And for God's sake, don't take Thomas's side in whatever's about to happen." Thomas stood frozen near the bar, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track confusion, anger, fear, indignation. He watched Paul brush glass from Sophia's sleeve with a tenderness that seemed to mock everything Thomas believed about power and control. "I don't know who you think you are," Thomas started, his voice trying to reclaim authority but landing somewhere near desperation. "But you can't just—" Paul turned his head slowly. Didn't fully face Thomas. Just turned his head enough that his eyes locked onto the manager with the weight of a physical blow. Thomas's sentence died mid-breath. "We'll talk," Paul said quietly. "After I make sure she's taken care of. You'll wait." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of what would happen next, delivered with the certainty of gravity or sunrise inevitable, unchangeable, absolute. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to call security, assert his authority, reclaim control of his domain. But his body wouldn't cooperate. His feet stayed planted. His mouth stayed closed. Because some primal part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive on the savannah, was screaming that challenging this man further would be the last mistake he ever made. Another server, Maria, who'd worked under Thomas's tyranny for 8 months, took the opportunity to approach Paul cautiously. "Sir, I can get the first aid kit, and maybe some clean clothes for Sophia?" Paul nodded once. "Thank you, that's kind." The simple courtesy, the respect in his tone when speaking to a server, landed like a revelation in the room. This man, who radiated danger like heat from a furnace, said please and thank you to staff, treated them like human beings worthy of basic decency, everything Thomas wasn't. Maria hurried off, and other servers began quietly cleaning up the glass, giving Paul and Thomas space but staying close enough to witness whatever happened next. Because they knew, all of them knew, that something fundamental had shifted in the Brass Lantern tonight. The balance of power had been exposed as an illusion, and the man who'd ruled through fear was standing in the ruins of his authority, finally understanding what everyone else had just learned. Sophia had never been alone. She'd never needed to defend herself. She'd only needed to endure long enough for protection to arrive. And protection had a name, a face, and absolutely no intention of leaving until accounts were settled. You think you know where this is going? Subscribe now if you're confident. 15 minutes had passed. Sophia had returned from the back room wearing a borrowed black polo shirt, her hands cleaned and bandaged with simple white gauze. Her hair was pulled back into a fresh ponytail, and though her eyes carried the weight of what had happened, her posture remained composed, unbroken. Paul had waited at the bar, nursing the same whiskey he'd been drinking all evening. He hadn't spoken to Thomas, hadn't even looked at him, but his presence filled the space like a storm system hovering just offshore. Everyone could feel the pressure building, could sense that the real confrontation hadn't happened yet. Thomas had retreated to his small office off the main floor, but he'd emerged now, his initial fear hardening into something more dangerous. Wounded pride. He'd had 15 minutes to convince himself that he'd overreacted, that this Paul, whoever he was, had simply gotten lucky catching him off guard. This was still his bar, still his floor, still his authority to exercise. The evening rush had resumed its rhythm cautiously, carefully, like people walking on ice they weren't sure would hold. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Orders were placed, but everyone was watching, waiting for the second act. Sophia was clearing table 9 when it happened. She reached for a wine glass someone had left near the edge, her movements efficient and practiced. But Thomas appeared beside her, his timing deliberate, his presence invasive. "Not like that," he said sharply, his voice carrying across the room. "You're leaving water spots. How many times do I have to explain basic service standards?" Sophia paused, her hand hovering over the glass. "I was just—" Thomas grabbed her wrist, not violently, not like the shove, but firmly, possessively, his fingers wrapping around her forearm with enough pressure to make his point. "I'm talking," he said, leaning closer. "When I'm talking, you don't make excuses. You say, 'Yes, sir,' and you do better. Understood?" The bar went silent again, faster this time, like everyone had been waiting for exactly this moment. Sophia looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face, Her expression was perfectly calm, not defiant, not frightened, just patient, like she was waiting for something inevitable to occur. "Please let go," she said softly. 2 simple words, delivered without heat or fear. Thomas's grip tightened instead. "When I'm ready. First, you're going to acknowledge that you understand." A hand settled on Thomas's shoulder, not grabbing, not squeezing, just resting there with the weight of absolute authority. "Take your hand off her." Paul's voice came from directly behind Thomas, so close the manager could feel breath on his neck. Thomas's entire body went rigid. He'd been so focused on Sophia, so consumed with reasserting his dominance, that he hadn't seen Paul approach, hadn't heard the footsteps, hadn't noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere until it was too late. "This is between me and my employee," Thomas said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "No," Paul said simply. "It's not." The hand on Thomas's shoulder didn't move, but somehow its presence became heavier, more insistent. A silent command that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to survival instinct. Thomas released Sophia's wrist. She stepped back gracefully, rubbing her forearm where his fingers had been, her eyes meeting Paul's for just a moment. Something passed between them, not words, but understanding. Gratitude mixed with something else. The quiet acknowledgement between people who'd survived their own separate hells and recognized that survival in each other. Paul stepped around Thomas, positioning himself between the manager and Sophia. He was close enough now that Thomas could see the details he'd missed before. The scar along Paul's jawline, partially hidden by his beard. The calluses on his knuckles, the way his eyes didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't offer even a molecule of uncertainty. "You're going to walk away now," Paul said quietly. "You're going to go to your office, and you're going to wait there until I come talk to you. Are we clear?" Thomas wanted to refuse, wanted to call the police, wanted to do anything that would salvage what remained of his authority. But 40 pairs of eyes were watching him, and every single person in that room now understood what he'd been too blind to see. Power wasn't about who shouted loudest. It was about who others chose to follow when the shouting stopped. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was following Thomas Green anymore. Thomas walked to his office because his legs moved on autopilot, because 40 people watched him retreat, because staying meant facing something his mind couldn't process. The door clicked shut behind him, and he collapsed into his desk chair, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. Outside, the bar remained frozen in that terrible silence. Paul turned to Sophia, his expression softening immediately. "You sure you're okay?" She nodded, but her composure was finally beginning to crack, not from fear, but from the weight of holding everything together for so long. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Thank you." "You don't thank family," Paul said gently. He gestured toward the corner booth. "Sit. Take a minute. You've earned it." Sophia walked to the booth on legs that suddenly felt unsteady, sliding into the worn leather seat. Maria appeared instantly with a glass of water and a small plate of bread. "On the house," she whispered, squeezing Sophia's shoulder briefly before retreating. Paul stood in the center of the brass lantern, and for the first time, he addressed the room. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner, every table, every person holding their breath. "I apologize for the disruption to your evening," he said, with a politeness that somehow made him more intimidating, not less. "Please, continue your meals. Everything's going to be fine." It was the way he said fine that sent chills through the room, like he was making a promise and a threat simultaneously. Danny, the senior bartender, found his voice first. "Can I get you anything, sir? Another drink?" Paul glanced at his untouched whiskey, still sitting where he'd left it. "No, thank you. I'm good." Then he walked toward Thomas's office, his footsteps the only sound in the entire establishment. The jazz had stopped playing, someone had turned off the speakers. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, cooks and dishwashers finding excuses to peer through the service window. Paul didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Thomas stood immediately, trying to summon whatever authority remained. "Look, I don't know what your relationship is with Sophia, but this is still my bar, and I have every right to." "Sit down." Paul's voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas sat. Paul didn't. He stood in front of the desk, hands relaxed at his sides, his presence filling the small office like water filling a locked room. "I'm going to explain something to you, Thomas, and I need you to listen very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Thomas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sophia came to this city because she was running from someone who hurt her, Paul continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. Someone who made her feel small, powerless, afraid to exist. She came here because people I trust asked me to protect her, to give her a chance to rebuild her life without looking over her shoulder. He paused, letting the words settle. I gave her that apartment. I made calls to get her this job. I personally vouched for her safety. Do you understand what that means, Thomas? Thomas shook his head mutely. It means that when you put your hands on her, when you humiliated her, when you shoved her to the ground in front of a room full of people, you weren't just being cruel to a waitress. You were breaking a promise I made. You were violating something sacred. Paul's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone cold, the kind of cold that exists at the bottom of the ocean, in places where light doesn't reach. In my world, Thomas, that's a debt, and debts always get paid. I didn't know, Thomas started, his voice breaking. Nobody told me she was. I mean, how was I supposed to? You weren't supposed to put your hands on anyone, Paul interrupted quietly. Manager or not, bad day or not, that's basic human decency. But you did it anyway, because you're a small man who mistakes cruelty for strength. Thomas's face flushed red, shame and anger warring across his features. Paul leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack up your personal items. You're going to leave this bar tonight, and you're never coming back. Not as an employee. Not as a customer. Not even to walk past on the sidewalk. You can't fire me, Thomas said desperately. You don't own this place, Vincent. Vincent and I go back 20 years, Paul said simply. Who do you think he's going to believe? The question hung in the air, rhetorical and devastating. Thomas slumped in his chair, the last of his resistance crumbling. This isn't fair. No, Paul agreed. What you did to Sophia wasn't fair. This? He gestured at the office, at Thomas's collapsed posture. This is mercy. He straightened, adjusting his sleeves. You have 10 minutes. After that, I come back. And you don't want me to come back. Paul walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. One more thing, Thomas. If I ever hear that you've treated another employee anywhere, any job the way you treated people here, we'll have a very different conversation. And I won't be this generous. He didn't wait for a response. He simply opened the door and stepped out, leaving Thomas alone with the wreckage of his authority and the terrifying certainty that he'd just been given the only warning he would ever receive. Outside, the bar began to breathe again. But everyone knew, the brass lantern would never be the same. If you're still watching without subscribing, understand something. You're choosing to watch power happen instead of stepping into it. Hit subscribe. Don't be the one who stands by doing nothing. Thomas Green left through the back door of the brass lantern 12 minutes later, carrying a cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a framed photo of himself in his high school football uniform, and a half-empty bottle of cologne he kept in his desk drawer. His face was blotchy, his eyes red-rimmed, and his hands still trembled as he fumbled with his car keys. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't make eye contact with the kitchen staff who watched him pass, didn't look back at the bar that had been the center of his identity for 3 years, because looking back would mean acknowledging what he'd lost, and Thomas wasn't ready for that kind of honesty yet. Inside, Paul stood near the bar, speaking quietly with Danny, the senior bartender. Vincent should be back tomorrow, Paul was saying. Can you manage the floor tonight? Just get through the rest of the shift. Danny nodded quickly, still visibly nervous, but honored by the trust. Yes, sir. Absolutely. We'll take care of everything. Good man. Paul placed a hand briefly on Danny's shoulder, the same gesture that had terrified Thomas. But here it felt different. Affirming. Respectful. And Danny? The way Thomas ran this place? That's over. You treat people right, they'll work hard for you. You don't need fear to get respect. Understood, Danny said, his voice stronger now. He glanced toward where Sophia still sat in the corner booth, sipping water and speaking quietly with Maria. Will she be okay? She's stronger than all of us, Paul said simply. But yeah, she'll be okay. The evening continued with a strange, tentative energy. Patrons who'd been planning to leave early found reasons to stay, ordering another round, lingering over dessert. They'd witnessed something significant, something that would become a story they'd tell for years. I was there the night Paul Ricca walked into the brass lantern. The night power shifted hands without a single punch thrown. The servers moved differently too, shoulders a little straighter, voices a little clearer, like they'd been holding their breath for years and someone had finally told them it was safe to exhale. Paul approached Sophia's booth an hour later, sliding into the seat across from her. The bar had thinned out just a handful of regulars nursing final drinks. The dinner rush officially over. "You should go home," he said gently. "You've had enough for one night." Sophia looked up from the cup of coffee Maria had brought her. "I can finish my shift. I don't want anyone to think." "Nobody thinks you're weak," Paul interrupted. "Trust me, after tonight, that's the last thing anyone thinks about you." She smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived in the city. "He was scared of you." "He should have been scared of you," Paul countered. "You're the one who survived whatever brought you here. You're the one who got back up off that floor without falling apart. I just showed up." "You did more than show up." Sophia's voice caught slightly. "You kept your promise. When Elena told me to call you, I didn't know if I could trust it. Didn't know if anyone would actually—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough." Paul leaned back, his expression softening in a way few people ever saw. "Elena saved my sister's life 15 years ago, got her out of a situation that would have killed her. So, when Elena calls and says someone needs help, I don't ask questions, I just help. That's how this works. That's how we survive." "Your sister, is she okay now?" "She's a doctor in Seattle," Paul said, pride evident in his voice. "Married, 2 kids. She got the chance to become who she was supposed to be, instead of who circumstances tried to make her." He met Sophia's eyes. "That's what I want for you. The chance to become who you're supposed to be." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd allowed herself to shed all night. "I left people behind," she whispered. "People I love. I promised them I'd build something better and bring them here. But some days I wake up and wonder if I made a mistake. If I'm strong enough to actually do this." "You are," Paul said with absolute certainty. "You know how I know? Because you're still here. Because you didn't quit after the first time Thomas humiliated you. Because you got knocked down tonight and your first thought wasn't revenge or rage, it was getting back to work." He paused. "That's not weakness, Sophia. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smiling through tears. "Elena said you were good people. She didn't mention you were also a therapist." Paul laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed his entire face. "I'm definitely not qualified for that. I just know what it looks like when someone's fighting to survive. And I know that people like us, we look out for each other. Not because we're weak, because we're strong enough to admit we can't do everything alone." Maria approached tentatively. "Sorry to interrupt, but Vincent just called. He heard what happened, and he's on his way back from his trip. Should be here in about 3 hours. He wanted me to tell you he's sorry, Paul. He had no idea Thomas was—" She gestured helplessly. "It's handled," Paul said simply. "Tell Vincent I'll talk to him tomorrow. Tonight, just close up normal time. Everything's fine." After Maria left, Sophia stood slowly, testing her legs. "I should go. Let you get home too." "I'll walk you out," Paul said, rising with her. They moved through the bar together, and every person they passed nodded respectfully, not to Paul, but to both of them. Sophia noticed it, felt something shift inside her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. Wasn't just another victim trying to disappear into the background. She was seen, protected, valued. At the door, Paul paused. "You take tomorrow off, paid. Come back Tuesday when you're ready." "I'll be ready," Sophia said firmly. "I know you will." He held the door open for her. "But take the time anyway. Healing isn't weakness either." As Sophia stepped out into the cool night air, she turned back once. "Paul, the people I left behind, when I'm ready to bring them here, will you help me?" Paul's answer was immediate. "Family takes care of family. When you're ready, we'll make it happen." Sophia nodded, something like hope blooming in her chest for the first time in months. She walked toward her car, her steps steadier than they'd been in years. Behind her, the brass lantern glowed warm in the darkness, no longer a place of fear, but a place where someone had finally stood up and said, "Enough." And that made all the difference. The next morning, Sophia woke to sunlight streaming through the barred windows of her studio apartment. For the first time since arriving in the city, she didn't jolt awake at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, didn't immediately check the locks on her door, didn't lie frozen under the covers, listening for danger. She made coffee in her tiny kitchen, the ritual slow and deliberate. As the water heated, She retrieved the photograph from her duffel bag, the one she kept hidden but looked at every morning and every night. The woman in the photo had Sophia's eyes. Her sister, Carmen, 7 years younger, holding a 5-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile. Diego, her nephew, the 2 people she loved most in the world, still back in a town she could never return to, waiting for her to build something safe enough to bring them home. Sophia traced their faces with her fingertip, her throat tight with emotion. "Soon," she whispered to their frozen smiles. "I promise. Soon." Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Paul. Elena gave me your number. How are you feeling today?" Sophia smiled, typing back. "Sore, but okay. Thank you for last night." The response came quickly. "Free this afternoon? Want to grab coffee? There are things we should talk about." 2 hours later, Sophia sat across from Paul at a quiet cafe, 6 blocks from her apartment. He'd chosen a corner table, positioning himself where he could see both entrances, a habit she recognized in herself. "You don't have to tell me everything," Paul said after they'd ordered. "But if we're going to keep you safe, I need to understand what we're keeping you safe from." Sophia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, gathering courage. "His name was Victor Reyes. I was married to him for 3 years. Paul's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "He was charming at first," Sophia continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Everyone loved him. Successful businessman, generous with friends, always knew exactly what to say. I thought I was lucky." She laughed bitterly. "Isn't that stupid? I actually thought I was lucky." "It's not stupid," Paul said quietly. "That's how people like him work. They're predators. They know how to hide what they are until you're too committed to leave easily." Sophia nodded, grateful he understood. "The first time he hit me," he cried after. "Said he was under stress, that it would never happen again. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him." She paused, staring into her coffee. "The second time, he didn't apologize. The third time, he told me it was my fault for making him angry." Paul's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. "It got worse. He controlled everything where I went, who I talked to, what I wore. He isolated me from my family, told them I was too busy to visit, made me quit my job so I was financially dependent on him, and when I tried to leave..." Her voice cracked. "He said he'd hurt Carmen and Diego, said he had connections, that no matter where they went, he'd find them. And I believed him, because by then, I'd seen what he was capable of." "How did you get out?" Paul asked. "Elena," Sophia said simply. "She ran a women's shelter 2 towns over. I met her at a grocery store. She saw the bruise on my arm, saw the way I flinched when someone moved too quickly. She gave me her card, told me if I ever needed help, she'd be there. 3 months later, after Victor broke my rib, I called her. She took a shaky breath. Elena got me out in the middle of the night. Fake ID, bus ticket, cash. She said she knew someone who could help me disappear, give me time to get strong enough to bring Carmen and Diego somewhere safe. She gave me your number." Paul absorbed this quietly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Victor, is he looking for you?" "I don't know," Sophia admitted. "I've been careful. No social media, no contact with anyone from back home except Carmen, and only through a secure app Elena set up. But Victor, he doesn't let go of things he considers his, and he considered me his property. He won't find you here," Paul said with absolute certainty. "And even if he does, he'll have to go through me first. And trust me, Sophia, I'm a lot harder to intimidate than Thomas Green." Sophia felt tears prick her eyes again. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Elena vouched for you. That's enough." Paul leaned forward slightly. "But also, I know what it's like to watch someone you love get hurt and feel powerless to stop it. My sister, the one I told you about, she went through something similar. Different details, same nightmare. If I'd known how to help her sooner, I would have. So now, when I get the chance to help someone else's sister, someone else's family member, I don't hesitate." "Your sister is lucky to have you," Sophia said softly. "And Carmen and Diego are lucky to have you," Paul countered. "You left everything to protect them. You're working a job where you get treated like garbage just so you can save money to bring them here. You didn't break when Thomas shoved you because you've survived worse, and you know this is temporary. That's not luck, Sophia. That's love. That's strength." Sophia wiped her eyes, smiling through tears. I just want them safe. I want Diego to grow up without being afraid. I want Carmen to have chances I never had. How much do you need? Paul asked directly. To bring them here, get them set up. How much? Sophia blinked, surprised by the question. I don't know exactly. First and last month's rent on a bigger apartment, travel costs, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 total. I've saved almost 2,000 so far. Paul pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. Check your bank account in about 10 minutes. What? No. Paul, I can't. You're not taking charity, Paul interrupted firmly. You're accepting help from family. There's a difference. And before you argue, understand something. Money I have. Time, we can't get back. The sooner Carmen and Diego are here, the sooner you can stop looking over your shoulder. The sooner you can actually start living instead of just surviving. Sophia stared at him, overwhelmed. I'll pay you back. Every cent. I promise. If it makes you feel better, sure, Paul said with a slight smile. But I'm not worried about it. What I want is for you to call Carmen tonight and tell her to start packing, because family shouldn't be separated longer than necessary. For the first time since leaving Victor, Sophia felt something unlock in her chest, a knot of fear and shame she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to thank you enough. Be happy, Paul said simply. Build the life you deserve. That's all the thanks I need. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee, watching people pass by the cafe window. Finally, Sophia spoke again. What happened with Thomas last night? I wasn't scared because I knew you were there. Because for the first time in years, I knew someone had my back. That's a gift, Paul. That's everything. Paul nodded slowly. In my world, we have a saying, you don't touch family. Not because we're violent or looking for fights, but because everyone deserves to have someone who stands up when they can't stand up themselves. Everyone deserves to know they're not alone. I'm not alone anymore, Sophia said, testing the words, feeling their truth. No, Paul agreed. You're not. And in that moment, in a quiet cafe on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Sophia Delgado began to believe that maybe finally she could stop running and start living. 3 weeks later, the brass lantern had transformed into something unrecognizable from the place Thomas Green had ruled through fear. Vincent, the owner, had returned from his trip mortified by what had happened under his absent management. He'd sat down with every staff member individually, apologized, and implemented new policies. Mandatory management training, anonymous complaint systems, and a strict zero-tolerance policy for abuse of any kind. This is supposed to be a place where people want to work, he'd told the assembled staff, not a place they're afraid to show up to. Danny had been promoted to floor manager, and his approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. He treated people like human beings. He said please and thank you. He asked servers how their days were going. He covered shifts when people had emergencies. And somehow miraculously the staff worked harder, smiled more genuinely, and the entire atmosphere of the brass lantern shifted from tense to welcoming. Sophia had returned to work after her day off, and while she still moved with that careful precision, there was something different about her now. She laughed occasionally at Danny's terrible jokes. She helped train a new server with patient kindness. She no longer flinched when someone approached from behind. The regulars noticed. Something's different about this place, one businessman commented to his colleague over drinks. Can't quite put my finger on it. Management changed, his colleague replied knowingly. New guy actually seems to give a damn. But the real change wasn't just management. It was the story that had rippled through the staff, the regular customers, and eventually throughout the neighborhood, the night someone had finally stood up to Thomas Green. The night Paul Ricca had walked into the brass lantern and reminded everyone that power without accountability is just tyranny waiting to collapse. On a Thursday evening, exactly 1 month after the incident, Sophia stood near the bar during a slow moment, checking her phone. A message from Carmen lit up her screen, accompanied by a photo. Her sister and Diego standing in front of a bus station, suitcases packed, huge smiles on their faces. Tomorrow. We'll be there tomorrow. I can't believe this is real. Sophia felt tears spring to her eyes, happy tears this time, not the frightened, exhausted tears she'd cried so many nights in her small apartment. Maria noticed immediately. You okay? More than okay, Sophia said, showing her the photo. My sister and nephew, they're coming here. Tomorrow. Maria squealed with delight, hugging Sophia impulsively. That's amazing. Oh my God, you must be so excited. I am, Sophia admitted, laughing through tears. I really am. Paul had helped arrange everything. A 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, furniture donations from people in his network, even a job interview for Carmen at a local clinic where she could use her medical assistant certification. Family takes care of family, he'd said when Sophia had tried to express her gratitude. This is what we do. That evening, as the dinner rush wound down, Vincent approached Sophia with an envelope. This is from all of us, he said warmly. A little welcome gift for your family. Nothing fancy. Just, we wanted to help. Inside was $500 in cash and a gift card to a local grocery store. Sophia stared at it, overwhelmed. I don't. You didn't have to. We wanted to, Vincent said firmly. You're part of this family now. And from what I hear, you've been through enough. Let us help make this transition a little easier. Around the bar, servers and kitchen staff were nodding. Smiling people who'd once been too afraid to speak up now united in genuine kindness. Later that night, as Sophia was finishing her shift, Paul walked through the door. He'd started coming by once or twice a week, never staying long, just checking in, maintaining presence without being intrusive. Heard tomorrow's the big day, he said, sliding onto a bar stool. Sophia beamed. Carmen sent me their bus schedule. They'll be here by 2 p.m. You need help picking them up? Moving stuff into the new place? Paul, you've done so much already. That's not what I asked, he interrupted gently. Do you need help? Sophia's smile softened. Yes, thank you. I'd really appreciate that. Done. He accepted the water Danny poured for him. How's Diego doing with the move? He's excited. Scared, but excited. Carmen says he keeps asking if there are parks here, if he'll make friends at his new school. Her voice caught. He doesn't really understand why we had to leave. Doesn't know about Victor, about what I was running from. Carmen just told him we were moving for my new job. He'll know when he's ready, Paul said wisely. For now, let him be a kid. Let him have normal problems like making friends and whether the new school's cafeteria food is any good. Sophia nodded, grateful for the perspective. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last few customers finish their meals, listening to the soft jazz that had replaced the tense silence of Thomas's regime. Can I ask you something? Sophia said finally. Anything. Why me? I mean, I understand Elena asked you to help, but you went so far beyond that. The apartment, the money, tonight with helping them move in. Why? Paul considered the question carefully. Because I can, he said simply. Because I have resources and connections, and the ability to make people's lives better, without it costing me anything that matters. And because. He paused, choosing his words. Because I believe the world works better when we take care of each other. Not because we expect something in return, but because it's right. Because everyone deserves a chance to be safe and happy and free. He met her eyes. You weren't just running from Victor. You were running toward something better, toward the life you deserved. And I got to be part of making that happen. That's not charity, Sophia. That's privilege. I'm lucky I got to help. Sophia wiped her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that month. You're a good man, Paul Ricca. He smiled that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. I'm just a man who remembers what it's like to feel powerless, and who decided a long time ago that if I ever had power, I'd use it to make sure other people didn't have to feel that way. As closing time approached, and Sophia gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door of the brass lantern, looking back at the warm lighting, the clean tables, the staff laughing together as they cleaned up. This place had almost broken her, had brought her to her knees on a floor covered in broken glass, had made her question whether she was strong enough to survive what she'd escaped. But it had also given her something unexpected, a family, not by blood, but by choice, by loyalty, by people who'd decided that standing up for each other mattered more than staying silent and safe. Tomorrow, Carmen and Diego would arrive. Tomorrow, Sophia would stop being a woman running from her past and become a woman building her future. And the brass lantern, the place where it had all changed, would always be the spot where she learned the most important lesson of her life. You're never as alone as you think you are. Sometimes protection is sitting 20 feet away, watching, waiting. Sometimes, family is the people who stand up when you can't. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is simply survive long enough for help to arrive. As Sophia stepped out into the cool night air, she whispered a promise to the stars. We made it. We're finally safe. Behind her, the brass lantern glowed warm in the darkness, a place where fear had been replaced by respect, where cruelty had given way to kindness, where one woman's courage and one man's loyalty had reminded an entire community what it meant to be human. And that was worth more than any power Thomas Green had ever imagined. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.